Let's stand together and read Luke 13, 10 through 17. You know that I've been in Psalm the past couple of weeks, and I call it my summer poetry series, and I like to spend some time in the poetry books in the summer. But we need to take a break from that too. And so this morning, we're going to be in the New Testament, right in the heart of the gospel, right in the middle of the gospel books in Luke 13. This is a Jesus story. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. And a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all of his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. God's people said, Amen. Please be seated. So it's a good thing. Jesus heals a woman. I mean, that's a good thing, right? I mean, she'd been bound for 18 years. She was bent over and couldn't stand up straight for 18 years. And Jesus heals her. But instead of everybody being excited and rejoicing and thinking, this is wonderful, this woman has just been set free from this terrible condition that she's had for 18 years, the synagogue leader, now remember, a synagogue is a Jewish church. It's just this might be in Capernaum. He spent a lot of his time in Galilee, or maybe over in Cana, or Nazareth, one of the towns that he would preach in the Galilee area. Let's just say Capernaum's probably where this was, a little seaside village. And they would have had their own synagogue. They would have had their own church. It's a Jewish church. It's a synagogue. And he's preaching there, and he sees this woman, and he heals her. Well, like I was saying, instead of being excited that this woman has been set free from this problem, the synagogue leader, this is the preacher, says, there's 6 days in the week for you to come and be healed. Come on those days. It's like he's looking out at the congregation, and that's what he said to them. He said, there's 6 days for work. Come be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. What a killjoy. What a grumpy dude. The woman has just been set free from her infirmity. Now she can stand up. She's just been healed of this issue. And instead of being excited about it, he says, there's 6 days for work. Come on those days. Don't come on the Sabbath. He was more concerned about the letter of the law than he was about another human being. You see that? Jesus told him, he said, I didn't break the Sabbath. He said, you take your donkey or your ox and lead it out from the stall to water on the Sabbath so it can get water on the Sabbath, don't you? He said, you see the play on words here. You unbind your ox or your donkey. In other words, they have it tied in the stall to keep it safe there. And he says, but you unbind it to let it out on the Sabbath so that it can get some water. Isn't it right for me to unbind this woman? Satan has kept her bound for 18 years. I just set her free. Much more than a drink of water. I've set her free from this infirmity. I've set her free from whatever this is. And instead of, he called them hypocrites. And hypocrites is in the plural here because he's not just talking to the synagogue leader, but there was probably others that were in agreement with him. And he's saying, you're being a hypocrite because you will let your donkey loose to get a drink of water on the Sabbath, but yet you're fussing, you're upset, you're indignant, is the word that Luke used here, because I set her free on the Sabbath. He said, I didn't break the Sabbath. See, Jesus told us in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He told us in Matthew 12, Mark 2, and Luke 6. It's in all of the synoptic Gospels that Jesus said, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And the way the synagogue leader was looking at this was, we all better fall in line, lockstep, with making sure that we follow the letter of the law. And the letter of the law stated that you couldn't work on the Sabbath. Well, if a doctor healed you on the Sabbath, then he's working. And so when he looks at Jesus healing this woman, to him, Jesus is doing work. He's working because he's healing her, which is a job, which is a doctor's job. He's healing her on the Sabbath. And so to the synagogue leader, Jesus is doing work on the Sabbath. And Jesus is saying, you're looking at this all wrong. You're looking at this wrong because what's more important than following the letter of the law? Now, rules are important. God's laws are very important, and He places them there for a reason. But catch this. God places His laws for our benefit. And what He's showing us in this illustration, in this story, is the illustration actually happened, but it shows us something. And what it's showing us is that God's laws are for our benefit. That's why He's placed laws before us to follow. Because if we will follow God's laws, this is what I just keep hammering and just keep saying, if we want to be happy, we need to follow God's laws. In other words, we need to do things God's way. And so when He puts laws before us, it's for our own good. It's for our own protection. It's like guardrails on a road. Or you could look at it this way. It's like the yellow line on the road that separates which direction you're going. And so God places things in our lives for our good. And the synagogue leader just wasn't seeing that at all. For him, it's all about, I don't care if you have to suffer another day, you're going to follow the letter of this law. And Jesus is saying, I set her free, just like you set your donkeys free. You're a hypocrite because you do things that benefit an animal on the Sabbath. Why can't I do something that benefits this daughter of Abraham? And that just means she's a Jewish woman, is all he's saying when he says that. She's loved by God. She belongs to God. She's one of God's people. And so are all of we. And so Jesus is teaching us by healing her on the Sabbath that He's the Lord of the Sabbath, that the Sabbath is for us. It's not so that it's another rule or regulation for us to follow. God is much more interested in our relationship with Him than anything else in the world. And so this is a good illustration of that. Now Jesus healed other people on the Sabbath as well. He ran into trouble with the Pharisees, and of course, eventually, they crucified Him because of this and claiming to be God. Because He's saying, I'm God, I can heal you on the Sabbath if I want to. And to them, it's like, no, the Sabbath is all about rest. Well, even when God is resting, He's doing good. And so Jesus is saying, even on a day of rest, we can do good. I'm thankful that today is a day of rest for For us, we have moved the Sabbath to Sunday because in the New Testament church they began to call the Sunday the Lord's Day. And we meet together on Sunday because we're remembering the resurrection of Jesus, because he rose again on a Sunday. And so we've sort of moved our day of rest to Sunday, but I'm glad there's EMTs working today. I'm glad people are still doing good on this day. And so this is what Jesus is teaching. He's saying that people are more important than the letter of any law. And he's saying, look, I didn't break the law. Jesus is perfect. He was sinless. And he's trying to show them that they've taken this law and they've made it so difficult that they're excluding people. And we can't do that as a church. We've got to invite and welcome and work and do things to show the goodness of God. And so this is what he's doing, and this is the illustration that he's showing by this. Not only, Jesus also taught us, not only is he showing here that the letter of the law is not more important than people, but he showed us this several times, that people are more important than anything. Remember when he sent the demons into the herd of swine, and the swine all ran over the hillside and drowned themselves, and he ruined the economy for that area for that year when he did this. He knew he was. He's God. He knows what's going on. He's showing us that people are more important than the economy. People are more important than anything. There's a tremendous value on the human life, and God showed that when he gave Jesus to die for us. That shows my value, that God, the God of the universe, would do this. And so he sent the demons into the swine to show that people are more important than the economy. And when the men cut the hole in the ceiling and let the paralyzed guy down in front of Jesus, he didn't scold them for tearing up property. He healed the man. He forgave him of his sins to show that he was God, and that because only God can do that, and that our main need is a spiritual one. And then he also healed the man while he was at it, because the man needed that physical healing as well. Sometimes we've got to tear up some property to bring people to Jesus, and we see that there, because there's nothing more important than the human soul. And God is concerned about suffering. He's concerned about whatever it is that we're going through. So thankful that he walks with us through whatever it is that we might go through. And there are several times that he healed someone. He healed the man with the shriveled hand, you remember, on a Sabbath day. And so he is showing us, he's teaching us something here, I think, about grace. Because I deserve justice. Let's just be honest. I deserve justice, but God gave me mercy instead, and that's what grace is. So Jesus is extending grace to this woman. He's showing us what grace is. And there's another word that's connected to grace. God has showed this to us, and we need to show it to each other, and that's forgiveness. Because grace and forgiveness are connected. I deserve I deserve justice, but instead God gave me mercy, which is what grace is. And by doing so, he demonstrated forgiveness. And so we need to forgive each other. Now, there's another element to this story that I want to talk about. I don't want to ignore it. I want us to take it on. Notice that Luke, in his narrative here, tells us that this woman had this infirmity that was spiritual in nature. Did you catch that? And that even Jesus himself, when he said, I healed this woman who had been bound, do you see by who? By Satan. Did you see that? She'd been bound by Satan for 18 years, and Luke tells us here that this was a spiritual condition that was causing this woman to have a physical problem. Well, the thing that we need to ask, there's some liberal scholars like Barclay, for instance, and he's so good at history, but he's kind of liberal when it comes to the supernatural and when it comes to the miraculous. And he says, let me pause. Gloria, you okay? They check you out? So they checked your vitals and everything's good. Okay, all right. Well, we're just getting to a part of this that I want you to hear, because we're talking about, can a spiritual issue cause a physical manifestation? And the thing that we've got to ask ourselves, and people like Barclay would say this, some liberal scholars would say, well, they just didn't know the difference back then. They didn't know any better. They thought anytime you were sick, that was spiritual. Because they didn't know about germs. They didn't know about viruses. You know, they didn't know about the islands of Langerhans in your kidneys that causes diabetes. Now, they didn't know about these things. And so he would have just called anything spiritual. But I'm telling you this morning that that's false. That's wrong. Luke did know better. And I can show you where. In Luke chapter 9, 1 and 2, Luke writes this same Luke that wrote this passage. He says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons. Okay, there's the spiritual part. And to cure diseases. You see that he separates them into two? And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. You see that he separates spiritual warfare from physical infirmities. And I found all throughout the Gospels, I studied this, and I looked all throughout the Gospels in Matthew, Luke, John, Mark, where they separate. You know, there was a boy that was brought to Jesus who kept falling in the fire, and he kept having these seizures. And that was a demon. That was a demon possession. Well, you know, again, some liberal scholars would say, well, all that was epilepsy. They didn't know any better back then. They didn't know about diseases and illnesses, and so they're calling it a spiritual possession, but it probably wasn't. It was probably just epilepsy. But that's not what the Bible said. What the Bible says is that the boy was demon-possessed and Jesus cast out the demon. So what I want you to realize is that the New Testament differentiates between physical infirmities and spiritual possessions. And so here in this passage, we need to take this as it's written. We need to believe this as it's written, that it was some satanic attack that was causing her to be bent over for 18 years. So where are we going to go with that? Are we going to believe then that every time I get a headache, I say, well, that's a satanic attack. I've got a headache. It's Satan. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. Some physical problems that we have are physical illnesses. They're physical problems. They're caused by viruses. They're caused by bacteria. They're caused by imbalance in our system. They're caused by a genetic defect. But what I want us to recognize this morning is that it just might be a spiritual attack. We can't rule that out. We need to ask God. We need to talk to God about it. This woman had been bent over, where she couldn't stand up straight, for 18 years, and Jesus himself said that was from Satan. It might be that we, or people that we encounter, are having some sort of a physical ailment, and it is spiritual. I've often said God's always up to something good. I was glad to hear Michael even mention that moments ago, I think in his prayer. God is always up to something good. But we live in a spiritual world. There's spiritual warfare. Paul said that our enemy is not flesh and blood. It's the powers, the rulers, the principalities. He said this in Ephesians 6. And for us to stand our ground. But I want you to know what else Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, where he said that he had a thorn in his side, is what he called it. And you remember what he called it? A messenger of Satan. He said, because God has given me this incredible revelation to keep me humble, to keep me from being conceited because of the knowledge that I have, He's given me, God has allowed this physical problem, this painful problem that I have to deal with. This is what Paul said. And he called it a messenger of Satan. I don't ever want us to forget that we live in a supernatural world. The secular world is trying to separate the supernatural from our existence and say that's myth. That's just you're dreaming, or it's myth, it's not true. There's this physical world, and that's all we know. That's all there is. But the Bible is very clear that we live at the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. Remember, I've said everything's a miracle or nothing is a miracle. Either everything is supernatural or nothing is supernatural. Which is it? And we see here in this story the intersection of the supernatural with the physical. Because this woman did have some sort of a spiritual issue. And I wonder, when we are sick, when something is going wrong, when we don't feel good, when we're feeling depressed or oppressed, or even physical manifestations, sometimes I wonder, perhaps that is supernatural. Perhaps that is a satanic attack. So we've got to be on our guard. Paul says you've got to keep your armor on so that you can fight off the devil's fiery arrows that he's firing at you. So we are in a spiritual battle. We do live in a supernatural universe. Creation itself is a miracle. It's supernatural. The fact that we have life in our bodies is a miracle. It's supernatural. And so I don't want us to ever discount that there's a spiritual element even to the way we're feeling. Again, we've got to be careful that we don't take this too far and say, well, I've got a headache today. The devil is beating me over the head, or something like that. I'm not saying that. I want us to be reasonable about this. I want us to be mature about this. But I want us to acknowledge that we live in a supernatural plane. We live in a supernatural universe. And in this particular case, this woman was bound by Satan. Now think about the big picture. God knew she was going to run into Jesus that day. And He knew that Jesus, because God is Jesus, He knew He was going to heal her. John chapter 9, a blind man, blind from birth. The disciples said, who sinned? Him, somehow in the womb, or his parents, that he's born blind? They just assumed somebody had to sin. That's why he's born blind. And Jesus said, nobody sinned. He was born this way so that the Father could be glorified. And then Jesus healed him. So that's another thing I'm not saying. If you're having a headache, that doesn't mean, well, that's because you sinned. I'm not saying that either. But I am saying God is always up to something good. He allowed this to happen knowing that she was going to be set free that day. By the way, 18 years compared to eternity, how long is that? right? Okay? So 100 years compared to eternity, how long is that? Right? And so God knew what he was doing. He lets us go through training periods till he gets us where he wants us. But there's a spiritual layer to life. We accept the virgin birth. We accept that Jesus rose from the dead. Those are supernatural occurrences. Ask a scientist if those could happen. He would tell you, no, they could not. Well, ask a scientist how the universe got here and that God spoke it into existence, and he would say that can't happen either. But yet, we accept that by faith. We live in a supernatural world. Jesus set her free. Sometimes the disciples were healing people. Sometimes they were casting out demons. So we live in a supernatural world. I want us to remember this. Jesus is all about setting us free. Whether it be from a physical infirmity, whether it be from an illness, whatever it is, spiritual bondage, Jesus is all about setting us free. That's what he's about. He is the Sabbath. He is our Sabbath rest. When we accept him, we have the Sabbath. We have the rest that God is still enjoying to this day because he rested after creation. Do we show grace or do we just show justice? Do we show just justice or do we show mercy? Do we offer forgiveness? When we do, we're being like Christ. We're being like God.